Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Marcia McNutt, President of the United States National Academy of Sciences, where she also chairs the National Research Council, which is the operating arm of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and serves in key role in advising the nation on various important issues pertaining to science, to technology, to health. Dr. McNutt previously served as the editor-in-chief of the science journals, and prior to joining Science, was the director of the United States Geological Survey and science advisor to the United States Secretary of the Interior. And during her tenure there, responded to numerous major disasters, including earthquakes in Haiti, Chile, Japan, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Before joining the United States Geological Survey, Dr. McNutt served as president and chief executive officer of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. They are involved in many interesting projects, developing biological and chemical sensors for remote ocean deployment, installing the first deep sea cable observatory in United States waters, and also advancing the integration of artificial intelligence and autonomous underwater vehicles for various programs. She also served as the president of the American Geophysical Union, began her career in academia at MIT, did her undergraduate degree in physics, Colorado College, went on to do a PhD in earth sciences at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And one interesting little factoid here, Dr. McNutt is also a National Association of Underwater Instructors certified scuba diver, trained in underwater demolition with the United States Navy SEAL. So we don't get too many of those. But all that being said, a lot of really cool topics to go into today. Dr. Marcia McNutt, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, Ira. Thank you.
It's awesome having you. Would love to start off, for people that are less familiar with you and maybe less familiar with sciences in general, would love to sort of go back and start around 1978 when you complete your dissertation at Scripps. This really interesting concept of isostasy, which I had to go into and learn a little bit about how the Earth's crust and the oceanic crust float differently than one another. But that research leads to an amazing amount of work, publications, adventures in terms of studying underwater earthquakes and volcanoes and atoll production and so forth in the Pacific. Take us back a little bit. Talk a little bit at that beginning of what got you into not just earth scientists, but sort of geophysics and the geosciences as well.
Sure. So I guess, Ira, I always pictured myself as a scientist. As a little child growing up in Minnesota, we spent all our time outdoors, even in winter. And so I just loved to go out and experience nature firsthand. So I knew I was going to be a scientist, but what kind of scientist was the question? And I remember distinctly the day when my undergraduate advisor, who was in the physics department at Colorado College, called me into his office, and he said to me, "So, Marcia, what are you going to do next year?" And I said to him, "Oh, I have this great idea." I said, "My best friend and I are going to become ski bums. We are going to spend a year at Sun Valley. We'll bartend at night. We'll ski all day. It'll be a wonderful year. And then I'll figure out what I want to do next after that." And my advisor goes, "Oh, no. You aren't going to do that. what will happen if you take that route is that you will fall in love with some ski instructor named Sven. And 3 years later, you'll find yourself with little kids running around your feet, wondering what happened to all your dreams. So he said, no, you're not going to be a ski bum. You're going to go to graduate school. And I said, well, I don't really know what I should study in graduate school. So I was asking him, but what would I study? Astrophysics and nuclear physics were the big fields at that time. And I said, should I go into one of those? He said, oh, no. He said, those fields have gotten to the point where all of the experiments are so large and involve so many people that you're going to be down in the et als in publications. You know, you're going to be one of a team of 500 doing the work. He said, but here is a field that I think you would really excel at. And he handed me the very first Scientific American article ever written about plate tectonics. It was by John Dewey. And I had taken geology courses in Colorado. Of course, who wouldn't? I mean, beautiful place to learn geology. But I had not really meshed with sort of the lack of rigor in geology at that time. But I read about plate tectonics and I said, this theory is so simple. It's so beautiful. It must be right. And I want to be part of this. So I said, this is amazing. This is what I want to do. But I said, I'm really worried that my parents, I had 3 younger sisters, they still had to go to college. I said, my parents can't pay for me to go to graduate school. My advisor handed me this form and he said, they won't have to pay anything. You will apply for an NSF graduate fellowship and you will get it. And that will pay for graduate school. So that's how I ended up then going to Scripps, studying underwater phenomenon and loving every minute of it. So everything is due to these people in our lives who give us such great advice. And we all just have to listen.
And, you know, again, you've published extensively on a wide range of themes, and one of the ones that comes into your work quite a bit. I'd love to sort of start off discussing this topic, and then we'll go into some examples. Is this principle of convergence that you've written quite a bit and talked a lot about, and you point out in papers like, I mean, there's one from 2017 entitled "Convergence of the Geosciences." You basically say, look, this is not interdisciplinary research. This is a little beyond that, where our research needs to focus on specifically addressing these complex societal problems, and you point out that, in the geosciences, for example, we put together geologists and seismologists and earthquake engineers so far over the years. But when we want to think that the connection to other disciplines, and I know you published, for instance, with Victor Zhao a bit on sort of the connection between the environment and health, we have to bring other people to the table. And you talk about, if we're interested in how air pollution affects chronic health, we got to bring environmental toxicology and microbiologists and public health professionals, even psychologists to the table. Talk about a little bit about what convergence means to you, based on everything you experienced, and then we'll go into some specific examples from your publications over the years.
Yes. So convergence is this sort of radical convening of researchers with very different backgrounds and very different skills that they bring to the table to solve some of the biggest challenges of our time. And it's an integration of these fields that, as you say, goes far beyond just interdisciplinary work where this person does this measurement and that person does that measurement. It's really taking the skill sets and the way of problem solving from all of these different fields and working together to solve these big issues like inequality, climate change, environmental stress, sustainability. All of these require a convergence approach. But the interesting part of it is that all of us are sort of trained in a disciplinary manner. My good friend and a predecessor as president of the National Academy, Bruce Alberts, calculated once that in a first-year biology class, you learn more new vocabulary than you do in Spanish 1. So the first problem in trying to promote convergent style approaches to solving problems is we speak different languages. And we have to start by learning each other's languages. Otherwise, we can't get anywhere.
So I appreciate laying the groundwork on that, and I'd love to now go down some of sort of these convergent tributaries that you've been publishing about over the years. I thought a really interesting place, of course, to start would be the oceans. In 2002, you produced these 2 publications. One was entitled "Developing the Ocean: Opportunities and Responsibilities," talking about everything that the ocean gives to us in terms of food, energy, potentially carbon capture, and so forth. And we have these new tools coming online, whether it's the AI and machine learning and so forth, to further help us to do that prospecting of that potential. And then a really interesting, and you're the CEO of Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute this time. And it's about engineering the ocean. And in 2002, you're projecting out to now in 2025 with all these really interesting topics in terms of robotic artificial intelligence tuna that would scare away, the smaller fish from the nets. You get into geoengineering, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then there's one part where you go, we had Craig Venter on a couple of months ago, and you take his stuff on steroids, where you posit about, is it possible to study some of the extremophiles on some of the moons in our solar system and how they deal with radiation resistance? Talk a little bit about this time, because this all coalesces again in sort of thinking about the oceans from a much more convergent perspective using technology.
Yes, yeah. So what I loved about being the CEO at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute was that it was founded by David Packard to be a NASA for the oceans. Yeah. And what he wanted to do was take the NASA approach, where you've got engineers, you've got geoscientists, you have people that understand radiation, astrophysics, all of this, bring them together to explore new worlds. And that's exactly what David Packard wanted the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute to do, was explore the new worlds of the oceans using convergent approaches and actually making teams out of scientists and engineers. And this may sound like obvious, like duh, but what was interesting was that if you look at most oceanographic institutions at that time, engineers worked for scientists. They did not work with scientists. And so the way we approached solving these big problems under the ocean, like, AI and understanding the ocean as this major biogeochemical reactor that's going on at all depths, at all times, in all oceans, and in subtly different ways because of the environmental changes from one spot to another. If we wanted to do that, we were going to have engineers as equals at the table with the scientists. So the way we would sort of do our planning is we'd go into a room with, say, 2 whiteboards, and the engineers write up on one whiteboard all of the amazing advances, like you talk about Craig Venter or AI, put all the amazing new tools that are being delivered, but not necessarily with the oceans in mind. And then on the other board, the scientists would write all of the outstanding problems that have been around for 100 years or more in the ocean that we never had the capacity to solve. And then we take the tools from this side and we match them with the problems on that side and decide that's what we're going to do. We're going to figure out how to make laser Raman spectroscopy work underwater. We're going to figure out how we can detect the DNA of microorganisms blooming in the ocean through their genetic fingerprint. We're going to figure out how we can autonomously search the ocean without having a direct connection to the human brain, but use AI for planning and scheduling that mission and knowing when the automated vehicle has achieved success and when it should come home with its data. So all of these things were done in a very, very convergent manner. And it was, to me, so fulfilling to see these major problems that had been around for so long and no one could solve, and yet we solved it. So let me give you just a couple examples.
Absolutely.
One example was a man named John Martin had proposed something called the iron fertilization hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And his view was that, well, in fact, it was a fact that there were areas of the ocean where there were plenty of nutrients to support plant growth. But the productivity of that part of the ocean seemed limited somehow. The plants weren't absorbing all the nutrients that were there. So clearly that patch of the ocean could support more plant productivity, which is, of course, very important because plants take CO2 out of the upper ocean and they sequester it in organic matter. And so the idea of John Martin was, if we could figure out what is limiting plant production, we could increase the carbon capture in the ocean by stimulating more plant growth. And so his thought was that it was iron that was stimulating it. And we were able to develop autonomous underwater vehicles with iron sensors on them that could survey the ocean and look for in natural events that were injecting more iron into the ocean and see what the response was. And what we saw was that these natural events, like a submarine landslide, or something like that, that stirred up the ocean bottom and produced more iron, indeed, the plants then bloomed.
That's an awesome example. And it gets me. It got me thinking when I was reading that part of that chapter. Someone else that I had profiled a couple of years ago when he was heading up hurricane research at NOAA was Dr. Frank Marks, and he was talking about sort of this history going back to the 60s on this thing we had called Project Storm Fury. And I think in that particular case, it had to do with putting silver or something into a hurricane to make it a little less devastating. And forgive me, I don't know the geophysics on all this, but where are we in 2025 in terms of sort of these geoengineering projects? I mean, I know in some cases there can be a little contentious, but your thoughts on just whether it's iron seeding of the oceans or silver seeding of hurricanes, geoengineering concept.
Yeah, so the truth is, Ira, we've been geoengineering this planet for a very long time. Yeah. Not necessarily with any forethought into it. A good example is, of course, all the CO2 we've released into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, and we're seeing the impacts of warming the planet and all of the other things that go with that. Changing migrations of animals, changing ecosystems and what grows there, intensifying some extreme events like hurricanes, droughts, etc. So we have been unintentionally geoengineering the planet for a long time. But I think the controversy is when we are unintentionally geoengineering the planet, it's sort of hard to call someone out and say, you're the person responsible for this, because we're all complicit in it. But if we decide to intentionally geoengineer, One of the proposals, for example, is to put reflective particles up in the stratosphere, which will decrease the incoming solar radiation and therefore help offset some of the greenhouse gas warming that we've had. But the issues I see with that is, if that is done, someone intentionally does it. Someone sends up an airplane and spews these particles out, or does it with a balloon or whatever. And let's suppose this happens and suddenly the entire wheat harvest fails in Canada. Is whoever geoengineered now on the hook to compensate Canada for the failure of their wheat harvest? This is the problem with it. And this is why there's been a lot of concern about going forward with it, when we know there will be known knowns, but also known unknowns. But the worst is the unknown unknowns.
Right.
And that's what the problem's going to be.
Got it. Continuing along those lines and sort of going back to sort of the convergence, being able to solve these complex problems. One thing that you've written a bit about as well has been I'll put it in the basket of the disaster sciences. And obviously, I mentioned in your bio some of the things that you've been involved in. There was this piece in 2011 Oceanography that you wrote entitled "Black Swans: Wicked Problems in Science During Crises." And again, whether we're talking about an oil rig and an earthquake or a tsunami or a pandemic, I get, all these things fall into that. Talk a little bit about sort of, again, convergence in the disaster sciences, because this is, again, an area, whether we're using that AI, as you were saying, to find the iron blooms or get the fish away from the net or predict that next tsunami. Very important area, again, where we need to bring convergent thinking together.
Yeah, I think the most important cases for doing this is when there is a disaster, either of a type or scale that we've never seen before. You mentioned a pandemic, COVID. COVID was unlike really any pandemic we've seen before. We had not experienced this novel pathogen, and its deadly nature was incredible. You remember the reefer vans that were stacked up in the parking lots of the hospitals in New York City just to store all the deceased sick people. I mean, it was horrible. And the same thing can be said about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This was a blowout a mile deep in the ocean. No one had ever experienced that before. There had been shallow blowouts, but nothing that deep. So no one knew how to bring it under control. And in that piece you were mentioning, I really emphasized the issue of the no regrets actions. When you don't know what you're dealing with, you start with no regrets actions. And I think that's what we saw during the pandemic. For example, the first thing that people were recommending is mask wearing. We didn't know anything about how COVID was transmitted. We didn't know was it by touch? Was it by particles in the air? How is this transmitted? But we knew that asking people to wear masks was a no regrets action. It might help, but it might not help. But even if it didn't help, it wasn't going to make anyone worse. And so that's what the sort of approach we took to Deepwater Horizon 2. We started with the interventions in trying to stop the oil from coming out of this broken well. We started with the interventions that we knew wouldn't make the problem worse. It may not solve it, but at least wouldn't make it worse. Unfortunately, all of those failed. So we ended up in the end going with a risky solution, and that was capping the well. And the problem with putting this huge cap on the well to plug it from above was the concern that if there was any possibility of damage to the liner in the well, it would be like, let's suppose you've got a garden hose and it's, water's coming out of it. If you put your hand over the top of it, if the hose is perfectly intact, then you basically stop the water from spilling. But if the hose has some, tears or anything in it, all that happens by stopping it here is it's spewing out somewhere else. And that was exactly the concern with Deepwater Horizon, that if we capped it on the top, if there had been any damage to the well at depth, oil would start spewing out into the surrounding formations. It would crack its way up to the surface. And now instead of having one point of egress for the oil spill, we would have dozens, and it would make it worse. So in that case, we did take a very convergent approach in terms of looking at the geology around the well and the what was going to be the time scale for breaking those rocks. We looked at the hydrodynamics of the well. We looked at pressure, all sorts of different kind of data. And we came up with the notion that we could put the capping stack on and monitor its pressure. And the pressure would tell us whether the oil was seeping out into the ocean. Because, again, going back to this garden hose, if you put your hand over the garden hose and you got a lot of pressure, but the pressure starts dropping off, then the oil's going, or the water's going somewhere else, out these cracks in the hose. And that's what we were going to find in Deepwater Horizon. Well, as it turns out, the pressure wasn't as much as we thought. And so we thought maybe it's already leaking. But then we did a bunch of calculations using all of the data we had. And the experts decided instead that no, the pressure was low simply because that oil spill had been spewing oil into the Gulf of Mexico for several months at that point. And that's why the pressure was down. And so we were allowed to keep the capping stack on, and basically the oil spill ended. But as I say, you have to take these very careful sequential approaches using all of the skill sets you have, the engineering, the geology, everything, in order to figure out what are the lowest risk solutions. Let's try those first, and then finally solve the problem.
Talking about being careful for I know we'll go to tangent here, but we'll come back. I just have to ask, because I mentioned that you are certified and trained in underwater demolition explosives for the Navy and Navy SEALs. You're actually the second person on the show that had that. But put that aside for now. Any thing that you can talk about? Any cool stories related to this part of your training? Because I guess in the movies, we always see things going wrong, I guess, and, releasing a giant octopus or Godzilla or something coming up when you blow up the wrong thing. But any cool stories related to that part of your training? Can you tell us what you're blowing up, or not?
Yeah. So the training itself was a lot of fun. I, just to brag for a minute, I finished first in the class.
Nice.
And of course it was all men, but it just shows. I think the point that I learned from that was demolitions is all about precision. If the instructor tells you, I want you to sever the armature on this bulldozer. Okay, so if you go in and you don't use enough explosive and you don't sever it, you fail. If you blow the whole bulldozer to smithereens, that's not getting the job done either. Yeah. So it was all about precision. And that's what I think an important lesson I learned in my life was that you don't actually have to be the biggest or strongest, but you just have to exactly get the job done. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the reason, of course, that I went for this training was not because I was going to be blowing up bulldozers or anything like that. But during the earlier days of oceanography, if you wanted to image the structure of the Earth beneath the oceans, we had to generate some sound sources that would put sound into the ocean, and it would penetrate the bottom, and those sound waves would then bounce back, and we would have listening devices, hydrophones, on the surface of the ocean to listen for those echoes and learn from those echoes what the structure is of the Earth beneath the oceans. And it's used all the time for oil prospecting and for looking at hazards in the ocean, et cetera. Where are the faults? And how extensive are they, that sort of thing. So that's why I went there, was so that I could image the Earth beneath the oceans. And it was amazing the number of discoveries we made using this technique as to what the Earth looked like deep underneath the surface of the sediments of the ocean, and learning more about the history of the oceans that way.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Really cool. Moving forward to 2013, and you mentioned bio, 2013, 2016, you're serving as editor-in-chief of the science journals. And here, you're publishing on a range of things, everything from, as you said, disaster science, scientific communication, reproducibility crisis in science, onto things like germline editing with CRISPR. There's a cool paper you wrote on the hunt for MH370 and the tools that potentially we're going to need in the future to find things like that. Talk a little bit about 2013 to 2016, because it seems like quite an interesting time, and everything that I guess you get to edit and you get to look at. But as a geoscientist, looking at all these other disciplines and publishing on all these other things that are going on, which are crucial to all of us, talk about that time, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So I actually think being a geoscientist is a great background to approach something like Science Magazine, because the geosciences, to really do the geosciences, you have to have a certain understanding, of course, of geology, but also of physics and chemistry and biology, because so many sediments are biogenic, and of course, life forms really alter the surface of this planet. Mm-hmm. So coming into Science Magazine, being a geoscientist, I think naturally made me very interested in what the newest discoveries are in broadly, for everything from microorganisms to astrophysics. I remember my favorite day of the week was in the midweek, when all of the science editors, we'd all meet and they would tell me what the top papers are that they were about to accept and recommend for publishing. And I just loved that day, because they would explain to me, without using a lot of jargon, what was being reported in this paper and what the significance of it was. And I just adored listening to all of this, understanding it. And that was sort of the counterbalance to the part of the job which was not fun. And the part of the job that was not fun was dealing with disappointed authors whose papers were not accepted into the journal. And they all want to know exactly why their papers weren't accepted. And it's really hard to tell them, sort of tough love, that there may be nothing technically wrong with your paper. It may be perfectly fine, mm-hmm. but it's just not one of the very top ones that's going to drive the field. And of course, the, I think fortunate part of this is that there are literally thousands, maybe 10,000 journals out there for authors to publish their work. So just because they get turned down by science doesn't mean their paper's not going to get published. But nevertheless, they are disappointed anyway.
So moving on now to your leadership of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, looking at obviously your webpage as CEO, it mentions that in most of your current activity centers around what you call meta science, defining how to shape the culture and conduct of science to build trust, excellence, inclusivity, and integrity. I was watching a presentation you get at Boston University back in 2019, where you were talking about the fact that there's this term in the Oxford Dictionary now called post-truth. And you were saying where feelings and intuition have somehow become more valued over expertise, that scientists have somehow become this special interest group in certain corners of our society. Talk a little bit. I mean, obviously, this is a pretty interesting time we're in, and obviously, you're in this role where you have to balance. We need scientific integrity. We have to influence policy at the same time. Talk a little about your day to day, if you would, on some of the things that you're dealing with now as we're in 2025. And I guess an interesting place to start off. The second part of that would be your recent paper entitled "Science is Neither Red Nor Blue" in Science Magazine, November 2024, about, as somebody that has to go up to the hill and talk policy at the same time you talk science, what you're experiencing as we sit here on the 7th of 2025.
Oh, gosh, Ira, I just don't even know where to start in answering this question because there's so many facets to it. But I do not think that, I don't think that science really has changed that much in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of the quality of the work that's being done or its importance to our nation. There's that famous Vannevar Bush report, Science, the Endless Frontier, and it truly is an endless frontier. We are continually making new discoveries that can make our lives better here on Earth, that can help us have better health, that can help us live more in sync with our environment. All of these things are happening at a very rapid pace. And I don't think the quality has decreased from 20 years ago when scientists enjoyed very high levels of public trust. What we find now is that public trust in science has decreased. Scientists are still near the top of the heap. So the issue, I don't think, is just science. I think it's any people of authority are now being questioned by the public. And so the issue is, given that this is widespread and is not, confined to science, I don't think scientists feel like there's necessarily something that they've done wrong, but they realize they're going to have to do things very differently if we're going to regain that trust. And part of it is that scientists have to get out of their silos where scientists live on a campus with other faculty members and they aren't, and their kids are going to school with other children of scientists or at least academics. I think we really have to get out of those narrow confines and start having two-way conversations with people everywhere across the country. We have to understand, what are your concerns and how can science help you? How can science make your life better? And so that people feel that science is working for them, not independent of them. So I think that's an important first step that we have to do. And there are lots of others too. For example, one thing that I say to people is anyone can be a scientist. You don't need a PhD. All you need to do to be a scientist is to be curious about something you don't understand and put together a plan for trying to understand it. Mm-hmm. And that is the scientific method. And I think we also have to really emphasize with the public that science is not a list of facts. And unfortunately, many of us were taught science that way. You're taught these laws and Newton's law, Maxwell's equations. You're taught about friction and things like that. And of course, those are all very established scientific principles. But basically, when you get to the frontiers of science, everything is up for grabs. Mm-hmm. And what may be considered something that we believe today to be correct could be overturned in a few years because science is constantly moving forward. Mm-hmm. So I prefer when science is taught as being a method for understanding the truths in our natural world. It is not a list of facts. And those truths are constantly being revised. And we saw that with COVID. In the beginning, we felt, okay, we don't know what this is, but let's just treat it like we treated the Spanish flu. Well, it wasn't the Spanish flu. And a coronavirus we knew was similar to a cold virus. And that should have been our first clue right there, that this is going to evolve quickly. And so getting a vaccination in year one may not be the same vaccine you need in year two, because like any cold, it evolves. We haven't had any cure for the common cold simply because it evolves too quickly. Mm-hmm. And, we had to come up with a vaccine for COVID because it was simply too lethal. But nevertheless, like a cold, it is evolving. And we learned that quickly.
What one of the we discussed last week when we had Sudha Parikh on the show, your piece, A New Vision for American Science, where you introduced the Science and Technology Action Committee and what's going on in sort of this vast committee, Vision for American Science and Technology, where we're basically thinking about how we rebuild and reestablish United States science moving forward, bringing together scientists, industry, academia, philanthropy. Could you give us sort of the National Academy of Sciences perspective on the Science and Technology Action Committee, your involvement, and then if we could specifically carve out one component of the vast organization, which has to do with philanthropy, because you also recently just published on sort of the important transformative power of philanthropy. You don't think as much about in terms of scientific innovation, and you published with Mike Nestor a couple of weeks ago on that. Philanthropy's role, which is extremely important, but we may not profile the importance of it as much as we do some of the other mechanisms for advancing science. What if you could also spend a little time talking about that as well? It's kind of important.
Sure. So one of the important outcomes of this research juggernaut that the U.S. built in the decades following the Second World War was that it created vast wealth for a number of Americans. Bill Gates, Gordon Moore, Paul Allen, all of these people that cashed in big time because of the companies, the products, and the wealth they were able to build from investment in science and technology in America. And then after they amassed this huge wealth, they wanted to give it back. So they created these foundations to support more scientific research and also most of them are supporting it in a more convergent way than the federal government. Yep. The blueprint for the federal government's support of science was based on building different departments and different institutes for biomedical research, for environmental research, for basic science in the NSF. But even within the NSF in their basic science, there's an engineering division, and there's a geoscience division, and there's a life science division, and they all operate in their own silos, pretty much independently of each other. When these wealthy philanthropists came in and started these foundations, instead of focusing on disciplines, they focused on problems and attacking those problems in a convergent manner. So this is sort of a new component to the US research enterprise that was not anticipated back in the days following World War II when our federal research enterprise was built. And the federal research enterprise always had mechanisms for coordinating. You know, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which helps to connect things, and various committees like the National Technical NSTC, National Science and Technology Council. Yep. All of these groups help to coordinate the federal part of it. But now is the point where, in terms of basic research at US universities, philanthropy supports nearly as much as the government does in just basic research. But there's no coordination mechanism that tries to look for, but where are the gaps? These gaps that if we don't fill them, we're going to miss something important. Or where's the overlap where we're funding too much of something that's not really at cutting edge anymore. So part of the idea with these new groups, such as VAST, which is Visioning American Science and Technology, is to make the case that we can't just coordinate the federal portfolio. We also have to bring in philanthropy. But then there's another leg to this stool too, and that is industry. Before World War II, most American companies did not really invest in research. They sort of used tried and true technology, and they might, sort of tinker with it on the edges to make it a little bit more efficient or something like that. But there weren't big enterprises the way ultimately Bell Labs was, winning Nobel Prizes for the basic research they were doing. And the pharmaceutical companies that developed the COVID vaccine, this was all because they had these big research juggernauts that were inside industry. So the truth is, right now in this country, more research is being done in industry than it is anywhere else. In universities or government labs or private nonprofit labs, much more is being done by industry. And yet that isn't being coordinated with anything else either. And in fact, we often don't know what's going on. Something like 80% of the research in this country is done in company labs, but they only publish 5% of the papers. So we don't even know what's happening there.
Right. No, it's again, it's a really important initiative, and again, it's to see you bring together these different stakeholders under one roof to think and put a model together is just so very important as we move forward in the coming years for these. Civil, as you say in one of your papers, you talk about civilization saving science, and a lot of what we've been experiencing the last couple of years, whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change, these are not small issues, and again, we got to bring really the smartest people to the table that come from this convergent mindset. That being said, what in 2025, Marcia, what are the areas of innovation that personally excite you? again, in looking through this one paper that you wrote recently in 2022 on civilization saving sciences, one of the areas that stuck out that we haven't really talked a lot about, or maybe not hear as much about as we should, is this principle of ecosystem services that which sort of go beyond. We talk a little about One Health on the show and sort of the importance, between humans and animals and sort of the environment. You take this as sort of another step that, hey, without clean air and clean water and a decent coral reef system here and proper nutrient recycling, things break down pretty fast on this planet, and we got to think about projects that deal with with all these that may not exist currently. Talk a little about ecosystem services and a little bit of what other types of things you're excited about as we get into 2025.
Yeah, so ecosystem services isn't necessarily something new, but as we start straining the ecosystems around us to provide these services, we're starting to see them break down. And it really takes a lot of forethought to make sure that decisions we make in terms of land use change are done in a way that we preserve those ecosystem services. A gorgeous example of forethought is New York City. Mm. New York City bought up the area outside the city in the Adirondacks that actually were the source of clean water that was coming down the mountains towards the coast. And they prevented that area from being deforested, which meant that New York City has one of the best water systems of any major US city because of that careful thought about where are we going to get clean water for perpetuity for a large city like New York. And we have to think about the same thing about soil health. Everyone's heard about the Dust Bowl days of the 1930s and the horrors that came out of that. We have to prevent soil erosion. And these systems are also connected. The fertilization that is done to the fields in the Midwest in order to increase crop yields is then producing these harmful algal blooms and eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico. And eutrophication is when there's so much fertilizer coming down the Mississippi River that it produces this huge spawning of plants and animals that basically suck out all the oxygen in the ocean, and the fish die. So these things are all connected in very complex ways. It used to be. I have a ranch out in California, and back in the 1920s, that ranch had a garden to grow vegetables. It had a orchard for fruit. It raised chickens and cattle. They hayed the flat areas to take the cattle through the dry season. And the people who lived in the farmhouse went once a month over to Carmel Valley to get coffee and sugar. Those were the only two things they needed. Now you could go to any farm in America and find that it's monoculture. It only is growing corn. It's only growing wheat, or it's a ranch that's only raising beef. And so, the system that was on our ranch here in the 1920s and 30s, where the manure from the livestock fertilized the garden and the orchard, all of that is broken down when you have a monoculture. You don't have these parts of the system reinforcing each other. And I think we just have to start rethinking how we're managing our land so that everything is back in harmony.
Yeah, very elegant. Very elegant. What I look at, and of course we put links to your to the National Academy's page and sort of the upcoming schedule of various meetings and conferences per NAS. Um, did I miss any besides that and the Science and Technology Action Committee? Anything else that's public facing that we should know about while we have you today for 2025 as we get into the new year? And anything else that you want to mention while we have you today, please take the floor.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we haven't covered that I'm very passionate about, but it's like been the hardest problem to solve, and that is K through 12 education.
Yep.
Right now in this country, if we didn't give visas and work permits to foreign scientists coming here to our universities for undergraduate and graduate degrees, we would not be able to fill all the jobs we have that require science, technology, engineering, medical training. We would not be able to fill them. And the reason we can't fill them is that the students who are coming out of our own K-12 system are just not being inspired for science and engineering, and they're not being adequately trained. And this is such a hard problem to solve because every school system's independent. They all have their own way of making decisions on curriculum and what classes to offer and what books the kids are reading and things like that. And so we've just been working really hard to try to find where is a lever that we can actually impact K through 12 education and get more children excited about science and engineering and sufficiently trained that they can compete with all these foreign students who are coming in from overseas. And right now, very few of them are competitive. One thing that gives me hope for this is AI, because AI actually has the potential to work as almost a private tutor with students to help them learn what they need to learn and to inspire them about the excitement in careers in science and engineering. So that's my one hope, but I think this is a problem that's been around for a long time. And I have to say, I was at a we've had this problem also about trying to engage all of America in science and engineering. When I started out, it was all men, it was all boys and men who were in science. Now we're starting to get more women in, but we still aren't getting enough people from minority groups, African Americans, Hispanic students. And so we really have to call on all of America to contribute to our science and engineering enterprise. I remember years ago, I was at a meeting at NSF. NSF had given some fellowships to women. This was back in the probably 1980s, early 90s. They gave these fellowships to women to take a sabbatical year, as long as they went to a department that had no women in it. And the idea of this program was to, first of all, get these departments to realize, oh, it is not so scary and horrible to have a woman in our department. And, it's amazing to think today that we would have to do that, but we did. And also to get the women involved with the students in these departments and hopefully attract more students into it. And at this meeting at NSF, after we all had our fellowship year, I asked how many women in the room had gone to an all-women's institution. And about 2/3 of the hands went up. And that was by no means a statistical representation of how women are educated in America. But because women went to all women's institutions, they were not discouraged from taking math and science. And then I asked them, how many of those institutions are still single sex? Almost every hand went down. But I think we've mostly solved the problem with women. We are now at universities, there are more women than men in colleges and universities in America. But we still have to reach those underrepresented groups as well.
Extremely important. We try to do our piece to advance that excitement and hope about the possibilities of what science and technology bring us. I have 3 kids in this house, and it seems like they're all headed in that direction. I try to get them to watch the show as much as possible. They roll their eyes at me, but nonetheless, I think I have a neuroscientist, a physicist, and a biologist upstairs. So trying to do our part here.
Lucky but you. Yeah. That's terrific. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. Really awesome stuff, Marcia. I mean, I've enjoyed, well, prior to talking with you, reading all about everything you've been up to since you started studying the geosciences.
Ira, you know more about me than I know about me at this point. I'm absolutely overwhelmed by all the groundwork you did for this.
Well, I was overwhelmed by your publications, and I apologize if I speak out of turn about some of the science, but really an amazing path you've been on, Marcia. I just wish you the organization the best with all of this as you continue, whether it's national academies, whether it's Science and Technology Action Committee. Again, for everybody that is going to be joining us across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching with us across on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Marcia McNutt, President, United States Academy of Sciences. Marcia, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while about everything you've been up to. I mean, thank you for everything you do. And again, we like to say on our show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us via what you do. Really an awesome story, and looking forward to continue to watch your journey, and wishing you the best with all of it.
Thank you so much, Ira. This has been fun, and thank you for talking to me today. This is great.
Great having you.